Attack on Titan is nearing its end, and with the anime and manga wrapping up, people are beginning to interpret what the show is saying and what its legacy will be. There is one such interpretation that I want to respond to, and it's from a YouTuber named Just Right. I want to take the time to respond to the arguments that he's making, because I believe that they're not only fallacious, but also misleading. I want to first make it very clear that this isn't a video meant to attack Just Right as a creator or as a person or anything of that sort. I love his content and I respect him as a content creator. This video is simply meant to combat his points and also explain why I believe he made many poor arguments. I want to make it very clear that this is in no way a hateful video about him. With that being said, I wish to point out why I believe that Just Right's video over the subtext of Attack on Titan, titled Attack on Titan and the Dangers of Allegory, is well-intentioned but sloppy with its use of the aforementioned source material and lax with its argumentation. So check out his video first if you want to have full context on all my arguments. But I will also be going through his video point by point, so if you like sweaty arguments over anime, let's begin.
And the problem we have with the series is we can ask questions like, does Attack on Titan endorse imperialism? But we're going to run into trouble when we try to figure out what's more important, the themes that are explicitly stated in the text, or the implications that exist as subtext.
A lot of this video hinges on this idea, whether what can be rationalized through examining subtext can override or muddy what the plain, obvious themes of the written work are saying. I'd say that this is where Just Right gets caught in a trap. If what you rationalize a subtext to be saying is negated by the actual text, then not only could it be true that the themes of the work are muddy, but perhaps it could also be true that part of your rationalization is actually starting from a faulty interpretation. I'll explain this in depth with further points, but I want to make one thing clear. The allegories in Attack on Titan can be muddy and sloppy if you interpret them in a certain way. However, this doesn't mean the plethora of plain text themes can simply be foregone to support some heinous conclusions.
Attack on Titan is a war story for the most part, and it often depicts war as horrific. One of the first scenes depicts the Survey Corps coming back after a disastrous mission, and one member of the unit breaking down and saying that their comrades died for nothing. That sense of futility in the face of the Titan threat is ever present throughout the story. On the other hand,
Did you catch that? Just Right is attempting here to say that this scene is going against the show's messages of violence ultimately being bad and war being horrific. However, what Just Right doesn't explain is that this particular scene, using the hype music and slow-mo shots of explosions and Mikasa looking like a bad bitch, is actually not a glorification of violence or war, but instead these elements are used as a reintroduction of the character of Mikasa. This takes place in season 4, episode 6, and we had yet to see Mikasa at all this season. This is due to the season starting off from the perspective of Eldians and Marley, such as Reiner, Gabby, and Falco. So this particular scene shows a reintroduction to a character after 6 episodes of a season and after a 4-year time skip. So that's why the music and shots are hyped. They're not hyped for the violence taking place. And you can also tell this from just a few shots after the one that he decided to use. This scene takes place.
エレン、あなたは自分が何をやったか分かってるの？あなたは民間人を殺した。もう取り返しがつかない。
This scene, and the scene of Eren causing this horror, is very clearly depicted as horrible and dreadful. I mean, if we had the hype music over these scenes... yeah, that would be a problem. But this entire season so far has depicted the violence as gruesome and heinous, not something to be cheering on. But one thing is very clear. This particular scene was taken out of context to attempt to make a point that the anti-war messaging is messy. Now, I'm not saying that Just Right purposefully took this out of context, But as we'll continue to see, I believe that Just Right started with the conclusion that Attack on Titan had messy themes, and then retroactively looked for scenes that he thought agreed with this conclusion. It's dangerous to do this in argumentation because you can definitely use things that actually don't support your argument, like the aforementioned scene.
The audience is inundated with image after image of incredible feats of violence to gawk at. Just hours and hours of soldiers looking awesome in their uniforms doing awesome things.
He goes on to further explain how there's countless hours of soldiers looking cool in their uniforms and doing badass feats with violence. But he shows scenes of this with Titans. The show has often made very clear that human-on-human violence is terrible and begets more violence. Now, we can have a discussion about how Titans are humans, but it's clear that they don't have a level of awareness or sentience, except this one. Oh, now that one's zaddy. But regardless of that, the scenes prior to the reveal that the Titans are human in Season 3 depict badass scenes of violence not to glorify violence or war, but to show the struggles and prowess of particular characters. Just Right himself stated that the show very clearly shows the futility against the Titan threat. So then the cool shots of people in uniform are used as a way of indicating that they're able to tackle something that is incredibly difficult to fight against. You can have an anti-war story that shows violence in a way in which the audience does cheer on the protagonists. Or are we saying that if violence is ever depicted in a quote-unquote cool way, that the art can never have anti-war messaging? Again, the Titans are clearly depicted as an unstoppable threat for the first 3 seasons of the show. The protagonist being able to combat this threat is depicted with awe because it is impressive, based on the force that we've seen from the Titans in prior seasons. And it shows off the protagonists in our story and their progression. It's a weird implication that he's making, that violence against the Titan threat is the same or similar to violence against humans. If anything, this juxtaposition of violence against Titans and violence against humans is meant to make us think even more about the violence that our characters commit against humans in Season 3 and 4, rather than desensitize us to it.
Military solutions are also the only solutions in Attack on Titan. The setup for the world doesn't allow any other alternative. Soldiers are also the only competent people in this world, with all of the government officials being corrupt bureaucrats. The text can say war is bad. Aw shucks, I just wish we didn't have to do all this warring all the time. Aw geez. But the subtext and imagery is constantly screaming, look how fucking cool this is!
Here he correctly states that the military solutions are the only solutions that the show depicts, at least for the first 3 seasons. I mean, the initial premise of the series is a war against Titans from invading the walls. All of our protagonists thus join the military force that gives them the capabilities to tackle the Titans. The issue is that he keeps comparing anti-Titan violence to traditional war. Let's be clear here what the first 3 seasons of Attack on Titan are actually doing. They're depicting a nationalistic tendency and then slowly tearing apart nationalism throughout the rest of the series. We can even see this in the openings of the anime itself, nationalistic bops that show flags and the military in a positive light, fighting the Titan threat. Compare this then to Season 4, also a nationalistic theme, but depicting soldiers as mindless and war as continual and destruction as endless. Just death. So to say that Seasons 1 through 3 showing Titan killing as cool sometimes, then somehow means that the themes of the show are muddy, just depicts a lack of understanding of the themes themselves. It'd be like watching a show like Mr. Robot, and after Season 1 claiming it's pro-cyber terrorism. And also, for those who haven't seen Mr. Robot, oh my god, go watch it right now. It's my favorite show of all time. Rami Malek's immaculate, and the story's amazing.
Now, the manga began publication in 2008, but rocketed to success upon the release of the anime in 2013. A year later, Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, a right-wing nationalist, circumvented Article 9 of the Japanese Constitution. That article has been in place since the end of World War II and states that Japan can't use military force to settle disputes with other countries. Abe got around this at least temporarily and has boosted defense spending by 10% after years of decline. For Abe and other nationalists in Japan, Article 9 is humiliating, an unfair restriction placed on them by the United States. So at the time when Attack on Titan was reaching the height of its popularity with the release of the anime, the country it was being published in and catered towards was militarizing. It's not that much of a stretch to say that the series functioned as Japanese military propaganda.
This point is a very obscure one. He states it's not much of a stretch to depict Attack on Titan as functioning as military propaganda, partly because real-world events happen to coincide with its popularity. The amount of assumptions made within this argument are staggering. Was the author influenced by current military events to change his story? Were people made more positive towards the military as a result? How many people in Japan even agreed? And how many of those were drawn to Japan even agreed? It's akin to the anti-video game argument of violence increased during this particular year, and violent video game sales also increased, meaning violent video games are promoting violence and causing people to be more violent. What's clear here is a lack of understanding of what propaganda even is. Just Right here is depicting propaganda as essentially anything that depicts the military in any level of positive light, but the issue is that Attack on Titan very clearly has subverted that and doesn't depict the military as inherently good. Nationalism is essentially indistinguishable from radicalization in Attack on Titan. People like Flock, who I hate with a burning passion, and those who join the Jaegerists are initially radicalized by nationalistic ideas that their people and their country are more important than others, and top-ranking officials in the military are sometimes also depicted as cruel, bigoted, and ignorant. This isn't even including the military of other nations like Marley, who use literal child slave soldiers. I'm not saying that if you use a fictional military, your story can't still be propaganda. What I am saying is that there's a clear difference there. If it's a fictional military, being propaganda is more difficult, in that you need to depict the military in general as an inarguable good. But we know that from the text of Attack on Titan, that's just not the case. So his only argument for Attack on Titan being military propaganda is that they fight a threat and are seen in a positive light sometimes, and that the text happened to be written during a time in which the military of Japan was trying to gain more power. This argument that because Attack on Titan happened to be written during a time of a military power grab, thus it's likely to be propaganda, is a textbook example of correlation versus causation. Just because one thing happens around the time of another doesn't mean that they're causally linked. So, as an example, Mary Poppins was the most popular movie in 1964. 1964 was also when the Civil Rights Act was enshrined into law. Must mean that Mary Poppins' song is about how racism is bad.
Chim chimney, chim chimney, chim chim chiri.
Racism is bad. I think this is where I should explain what a necessary assumption is versus a sufficient assumption. An argumentation, a necessary assumption is an assumption that is one way to mean that a conclusion in an argument follows logically. So here's an example. If I were to say that an anime has battles, thus it is a shonen battle series, that's me making an assumption that all battle series are shonen battle series. But we know that this isn't the case. Like, take Cowboy Bebop, for example. Has battles, but isn't a shonen. There are other assumptions that we're also making with this argument, like how other components aren't required to make an anime a shonen, just battles. The point is that there are multiple ways to attack an argument if an argument is structured in this way. What Just Right is doing here is he is often making an argument with necessary assumptions by tacitly making the assumption that if Attack on Titan has any violence that is sometimes glorified, that the series isn't anti-war. Is that a possibility? For sure. A series that is pro-violence or war or military would depict violence in a positive light. But like we pointed out prior, that doesn't mean that it's true in this case. You can show characters engaging in violence, yet be against human violence or war. He also makes the same mistake when he essentially states that if the series has the military shown in a positive light at any instance, then the series is military propaganda. Necessary assumption logical errors are easy to get into. Everyone has done it before, and I've done it before. See? That was sufficient. But I need to make it clear that the reason that I'm explaining this and calling out Just Right for doing it isn't because I'm super sweaty. I am. But it's because he's making some serious claims here, claiming that Attack on Titan is military propaganda, or claiming that it can be used as anti-Semitic material, which he claims later in the video, really requires more rigor to the argumentation than this video has. He needs to be asking himself the question, is there a counter here that would prove me wrong? That's the issue with necessary assumptions. What you're saying means your conclusion could be true, but it doesn't mean that it has to be true. He's arguing here that his conclusion is a certainty. We're figuring out that's not the case. I say all of this because the next argument is also a similar offender.
From the very first episode, Eren is angsty about the walls, about how they make him feel powerless. He regularly refers to feeling like an animal in a pen, that he's lost his dignity because of it.
In our hearts, we knew home was a pen. Humanity, cattle.
And when we learn the full context of the story, you can see how this taps into a familiar narrative often repeated by fascist movements that goes something like, we were once great, but then something happened that limited our power, and now we must crush our enemies to be great again.
Because there are fascist propaganda stories similar to the ones depicted in Attack on Titan, that must mean Attack on Titan is as well, I guess? But what he's leaving out, again, are the important details. Eren was displayed as the series protagonist for 3 seasons. We understood his motives and followed him. But in season 4, it's clear that he's radicalized, not only due to the memories and burden that he now has, but also due to that terrifying upbringing that Just Right mentions. Eren did feel like cattle because everyone there kinda was. They were constantly worried about man-eating monsters after all. But the show is also saying that his radicalization was bad, that he took the wrong lessons, that the fascist ideas that he created as a result of his radicalization are bad. That him becoming the man he is now is bad. Using Eren as an example here is weird because he's one of the villains of Attack on Titan now. The overly simplified comparison here can be used with almost any piece of media. I mean, I can say that Game of Thrones is fascist propaganda because it's a story that depicts the heroes as those in power by the end, that they are trapped by the White Walkers on the outside of the wall, and that the series is actually saying that borders and country are mandatory. But I mean, what the series is really saying is, well, I mean, we don't know yet. Finish the damn story, George! Overly simplified comparisons are dangerous, because cherry-picking ideas, such as how Attack on Titan takes place in a trapped country that feels militarily powerless, and then saying that's akin to fascist propaganda, because those would also have similar ideas, is intellectually defunct. Again, having some similar concepts doesn't mean two things are the same. And this is especially concerning when you're using fallacious logic to connect a piece of art that is clearly against fascism and uses Eren as a textbook example of fascist radicalization to then say that the art could be fascist propaganda. This video centers around the idea of subtext, but it appears that the actual text was often ignored to support certain arguments. If Attack on Titan is about anything, to me, it's about the fallacious argument of the greater good and radicalization. The series' villains are constantly stating that they did what they had to, but all it does is result in more suffering.
It's obvious that the fascist nation of Marley is condemned by the text, and the fascist movement that Eren builds in the story's final arc is also condemned by all of the remaining characters. So the big obvious fascists are the bad guys here. And yet, the story also has an arc where all of the good guy characters participate in a military coup.
Hey, he finally agrees that the text is outright anti-fascist, as again and again the series' villains are the fascists, but then proclaims that the military coup being depicted as a good thing is a sign that this theme, again, is actually muddy. But let's actually look at the arc in question and determine whether it's pro-military coup or not. The arc, unlike what Just Right claims, isn't actually just about the military being good, but rather about truth. The arc centers around the government holding the truth from the people. The end of season 2 shows that all Titans are actually people. This revelation, due to a lot of political intrigue, is a detriment to those in power. Our main cast are the only people who know the truth, and thus must go into hiding, as they are now enemy number 1 to the government. Let's also keep in mind that they are part of the Scouts, a portion of the military that protects humanity within the walls by exploring outside and dealing with Titans. There are multiple factions to the military in this series, so I also think it's important to denote that it isn't simply the military versus the government. It seems like a difference in semantics, but it is important to get all of the context around this so as to further explain how this arc isn't about the military, nor an endorsement of coups in general. The season isn't a story of the military coup of the government, but rather of the importance and the power of information and truth. The focus on Erwin, someone whose main mission in life is to discover the truth and reveal it, and Historia, someone whose true lineage is important throughout the season, further amplify that season 3 is about that, truth, and the power of it. I mean, even the end of the season is about the truth hidden in the basement. Yes, a coup does result in the military taking power, but Erwin's whole reason for the coup was so that the public would know the truth of the Titans and the island. He doesn't say, let's do the coup because the military can handle this better. Military are GOAT! The show, again, is making the argument for truth. A counter to this argument would be saying that, well, the military is on the side of the truth, which means the story is saying the military is good. But again, that would be ignoring the rest of the context of the entire series to get to this conclusion. The season is a commentary on freedom of information, not on the military. I also want to point out how this opening is extremely different from the others in the series, and it's the only one to this point that doesn't have a nationalistic tone or symbols, but rather it's a more character-focused, somber opening. You'd think that a season about the military would have an opening akin to that of other seasons, right? That it would be littered with symbols and showing how the military are the heroes. But like I said before, the focus isn't on the military versus the government, but rather on the truth versus lies. So to say that just because some of those in the military are on the side of the protagonist, that then means that the show is pro-coup is kind of a weird argument. A show can depict something while also not endorsing that thing in every single instance, like Breaking Bad and selling drugs, or Mr. Robot and cyber terrorism. Again, full context is important. You can't just pick out a piece of a story and claim that the story is saying something that is later contradicted. I mean, unless you want to pick out a piece of Mr. Robot and talk about how immaculate it is. Oh my god, season 1 has some wild twists, but don't get me started on season 3. Okay,
If a fascist were going to dramatize the exact conditions necessitating their own seizure of power, this would be it, right? Like, the government is ineffectual, you have to trust us, you have to trust the military. And it's kind of weird that the story never contemplates transferring power to some kind of democratically elected body. Like, I understand that this is a medieval-esque society, but the writer is the one who decides that. And their choice to make it that way says something about their intent and the work.
I mean, this isn't weird, because it is true that Historia is the rightful ruler based on the rules that this society currently has. I mean, I guess it's weird that any story that has a corrupt government doesn't immediately assume democratic control. Isn't that just a narrow mindset to have? He says he understands that this is a medieval society, but then essentially says, yeah, but also I don't want it to be that way. Again, Historia being crowned is seen as truth prevailing, rather than being a commentary on how dictatorships or monarchies are good. Do we all see now that the arguments being made here are all hinging on the assumption that the story is commentating on what he thinks that it is? No, this arc isn't commentating on what style of government is best. It's not saying dictatorships or military coups or what have you are what's right. Rather, what it is clearly saying is that the truth is what's important, that freedom of information is right. And if we're going to discuss how the story doesn't bring up how military control is bad, we can just look to season 4, where again, the hypocrisies of the current government are depicted, as they specifically hid information about Aaron and Zeke from the people, which ultimately leads to more violence. And the government also plans to use Historia. The story may not explicitly say that society should be ruled by the people, but it is saying that centralized information and control is ultimately harmful. But I guess it's fascist because it doesn't turn society into a democracy. Wah, wah.
It presents racism as this completely logical, rational conclusion. And what this misses about the persecution of the Jewish people under Nazi Germany is that anti-Semitism is fundamentally irrational. There is no justification for why vast swaths of the population in Europe decided to hate Jews rather than any other group of people. That's what makes anti-Semitism so insidious. And by implying there's a rational reason to hate the Eldians, the allegory is implying there's a rational reason to hate Jewish people. And there isn't.
I do think there are some good points with this assessment here, but I also think it can get into some dangerous territory quickly. I agree that the allegory to Jews falls apart in specific ways, such as if we use it on a character such as Tiber. But I also think that it's clear that the show is saying that, regardless of the logic, racism and bigotry is an inherent evil that further amplifies the horror that humanity is capable of. Like I said before, I believe that Attack on Titan is fundamentally against the argument of the greater good, which, by the way, is a fascist argument. So the argument that Marley uses against the Eldians, that because they can turn into Titans that they are devils and must be eradicated for the greater good, is still an unacceptable one. The argument is not what should matter when it comes to issues of racism. It's the rule that racism is bad, that othering people for things that they can't control is wrong. Full stop. I agree that if you're using this argument with the Eldians, you can make the argument that Just Right is making. You can say, look, they just made an allegory that the Eldians are akin to Jews due to the imagery that the show is using. So they're also saying that Jews have an inherent evil in them, like with the ability to turn into a Titan. But this argument clearly falls apart immediately, right? If the show is saying that Eldians are Jews and that they have an inherent evil in them, then the show is also saying that judging people for that is inherently wrong. So the argument is that the show is anti-Semitic, but is also anti-Semitic? Just Right does admit that this is weird. He says that the allegory is muddy, and that clearly the show isn't anti-Semitic. But then why immediately navigate to the interpretation that the allegory to Jews means that the Eldians are Jews, rather than interpreting the allegory as if Eldians are treated akin to how the Jews were treated? An allegory can be seen as a way to make viewers feel a certain way, obviously. So my interpretation is that in order to fully amplify the horrid treatment of the Eldians, the author chose to show their treatment in a way that would immediately hit an audience. Based on this interpretation, that the allegory stops at the treatment of the Eldians rather than the interpretation that the Eldians are Jews, the series' themes don't fall apart anymore. But I have to agree, because the allegory can be interpreted in multiple logically valid ways, it is definitely a dangerous allegory. I just have an issue that the worst interpretation was used here, and it's also implicitly portrayed as if it's the only possible interpretation. So let me restate this. Rather than the allegory being that the Eldians are Jews, I believe that it can be an allegory about the treatment of people who are othered, rather than that the people who are othered are the same.
Yeah, all of the Titans that the characters have been fighting this whole time are actually Eldian prisoners who the Marleyan government turns into Titans and then exiles on the island to keep the people in the walls from getting out. And this is the point in the video where we acknowledge that the race of monsters that are often depicted with large hooked noses are exclusively members of the race which we're allegorically connecting to Jews during the Holocaust.
Yeah, this one's yikes. He says here that they're often depicted with big noses, but no, they're not. This is an issue of cherry picking to support a conclusion. Again, this would be akin to me saying that Just Right is a 4channer because he went there for his video. Like, he's actually taking one of the few Titans in the entire series that's depicted this way and acting as if that means that Titans as a whole are depicted as Jewish caricatures. He then acknowledges that there are legitimate counterpoints to this by saying,
whenever I've seen that point brought up, I see pushback that it's an alarmist, overly sensitive point to make. That the Titans are caricaturized in a bunch of different ways. It's not just the noses.
But then he says,
but look, I won't post the comments here, but I did, do research for this video. I read the Chan boards. I know how these images are interpreted by white supremacists.
More yikes? So the argument that Titans are depicted as Jewish caricatures is supported by 4chan. You realize that this is a factual claim, right? Not an interpretive one, like the last. Allow me to explain. There are arguments based on validity, like the ones about the allegory used with the Eldians, that you just need to prove through logical argumentation. But then there are claims that are based on fact, not argument. It would be akin to me saying that because my cat doesn't have a tail, all cats don't have tails. And if you pointed out to me, well, look, those cats have tails. And then I said, look, I've done my research. A Facebook group about cats also says that they view all cats as not having tails. Do we see why that logic is so inherently faulty? It should also just be obvious, but terrible people, like white supremacists or anti-Semites or fascists, will often take things that aren't terrible to fit their lens. Or are we claiming that if anything is ever said about a piece of art by terrible people on 4chan, that it's true? Well, guess the Clintons are lizard people. No, they're not. Unless.
I can't say for certain that Isayama intended to send this message, but I do know what message is being received.
Yeah, you know what message is being received by the people who are terrible and are going to read terrible subtext in almost anything that they read or watch. So if 99% of people receive a piece of art in one way and 1% receive it in another way that supports their heinous worldview, then the 1% is correct, right? Look, factual claims shouldn't even be based on the receiving of the art. That's where interpretation should live. It's just factually untrue that Titans are displayed in a way in which they often have hooked noses. That should be where the argument should end, instead of consulting with 4chan as research. I'm sorry that I'm being a bit harsh here, but it is shocking to see this level of poor argumentation from this channel. This is by far the worst point in the video, specifically because of what I said before. This isn't an interpretive argument that can be proven based on valid reasoning. Instead, it's a factual one that he's attempting to dress up as if it's interpretive. After explaining events in season 4 that clearly show why racism is bad, Just Right says this.
So several of the main character stories are very obviously about how racism writ large is bad, which means we have a complicated situation here where the only way to resolve the issues around anti-Semitism is to defer to the artist's intent.
No, I don't think so. I think the issue falls on your interpretation. If your interpretation is conflicting with the narrative at hand, something is happening there. Your interpretation could be incorrect, the themes could be muddy, or it could be a bit of both. Here, I think it is a bit of both. I personally believe that as long as your interpretation of a piece of work is valid logically, it's an acceptable interpretation. But I also think that you can't then say that because you have a valid interpretation, that it is the only valid interpretation of the work. I think there's enough contradictions with Attack on Titan to definitively say that it is not anti-Semitic, and it appears Just Right agrees. But why then does he not ask himself, perhaps then there's another way for me to interpret this allegory? If he went down that route, it's entirely possible that he also comes to the conclusion that the allegory is about the treatment of those who are othered, rather than as an assertion that Eldians are equivalent to Jews in all ways. We've already addressed how the imperialistic fascist subtext is actually just an incorrect reading of the themes of the story, due to him not attributing the full context around the events that he explains throughout the video. He talks about concepts such as death of the author, and whether we should dismiss intent or not. The issue here, though, I believe, is just a misguided belief in the intent of the work. Almost all of the supporting points to his argument of the imperialistic, fascist, and anti-Semitic subtext were proven to be contextually inaccurate. He then uses these in conjunction with his valid interpretation of the allegory of Eldians being Jews to say something more nefarious. Again, I don't agree with his interpretation, like I've said many times, but that doesn't make it less valid. Like I said before, the issue is using a valid interpretation of the text to then criticize the text as if it's the only interpretation. An even bigger issue is when you combine a valid interpretation that could be saying some really yikes things with out of context evidence that you're essentially saying is true to try and make a broader, more nefarious claim.
The word that keeps coming to mind as I write this essay is careless. I think Isayama was careless in the construction of Attack on Titan's world, that he was focused on telling a snappy, twisty narrative and did not pause to consider the implications each twist had on the rest of the story, and that he allowed his own nationalistic sentiments to seep into the story. Attack on Titan is currently just a few months away from wrapping up both its manga run and its anime adaptation. When it does, it's going to leave behind a conflicted legacy, one of monumental global success and of potentially harmful ideas and themes.
Just Right says that Isayama was careless, and that may be true, but I also believe that Just Right was careless with this video. The arguments that he presents have inherent issues, such as flawed assumptions and out of context support. This is my first response video, and I want to make it clear that I made this video for a few reasons. One, I believe the argumentation is poor and lacks a lot of essential components that a valid argument requires. But I also think that his argument is something serious. His conclusion mentions how Attack on Titan will leave behind a legacy of harmful ideas and themes, and that was the line that made me want to make my video. I wanted to display how improper argumentation can lead to some outlandish conclusions to the media that we consume. It can turn a text that is clearly anti-war, anti-nationalism, and anti-radicalization into one about fascism and anti-Semitism. Proper argumentation is important, and if Attack on Titan's legacy truly does become one of harmful ideas, I want to be clear that it was poor argumentation that was the culprit.